I mean, let's just get this one out of the way firstly, Jess. Are you a Blairite or a Union girl?
I don't...
You can't be both, by the way. It's illegal.
Why can't you be both? I'm never, ever going to define myself by the name of a man in the Labour Party.
What, you mean even if it was a man that won you 3 elections?
There's some... I am literally in love with some of the things that Tony Blair did for my family. But what I would say is that I like every single thing that Angela Rayner said today. I want it. I see the problems of not having it. And with regard to productivity, I just want to say that the people with the most strike days in Europe and also the highest levels of trade union activity is France, which also has the highest levels of productivity in Europe when you look at the data. So I'm afraid to say that the line between the idea that I mean, at the moment, we have there's more strike days under this government than there were under the last Labour government by a country mile. So I have no idea why the Tories feel the need to constantly sort of have this bash against collective bargaining.
What's the deal there, Jonathan? I mean, there's a clear division now in the sand, isn't there? Although, you know, to many people who have been listening to Starmer perhaps try and re-modernise the party. It was modernised, and then there was a sense that it kind of went a little backwards, depending on your taste of politics. So James would completely disagree with that for obvious reasons, but there is that view out there. And Starmer's trying to get it back a couple of gears into a more Blairite sense, but Rayner there today sounding every bit the Corbyn girl rather than the Blair one.
Well, I'm going to do something that will one-up the Chancellor, but he knows is coming because I asked about it in Prime Minister's questions, which is Angela Rayner is completely correct about statutory sick pay reform, something I'm supporting the Centre for Progressive Change. John actually, as I say, raised it in the House. It's also backed, by the way, by Priti Patel and Sir Robert Buckland, and I don't think you could quite argue that these are somehow... And ultimately...
James nearly fell off his chair.
Well, because the data doesn't lie. A government did a study into this very thing, and 75% of businesses supported these reforms. And actually, we reckon it would be a £4 billion boost to the economy overall, because ultimately, if you have a healthier workforce... Now, let's not beat around the bush. There, of course, there's a massive concern at the moment about the amount of people on long-term sick, around the 2 million mark. There is definitely reforms, I believe, that need to be made to welfare in order to make sure that those people are actually in work who can work. But if we don't allow people, particularly those who work for Deliveroo or Uber, for example, or Amazon, to actually be entitled to proper sick pay, and we don't allow them to have the time to heal and rest, then ultimately, shock horror, people just get sicker and they stay off work longer. So I actually think that this is a common sense approach. And as I say, business themselves are calling for it. But look, where I will then bring back in the line between Jess and I suppose, on this issue. Look, I disagree with the repealing of the anti-strike laws. I do support those because ultimately I think, particularly with the NHS, when you're talking about saving lives, that there should be a minimum service requirement. There's plenty of other countries around the world that have those expectations. I'm also concerned about the repealing of the 50% threshold for voting when it comes to call for strike action. Ultimately, I think that if you're going... A tiny minority shouldn't be able to bring down an entire sector. And ultimately, that's where my concern lies, because I do worry that there is a politicisation in union leadership, not with union members themselves. And let's not forget, I was a trade union rep for 3.5 years as a teacher, that actually the leadership of these trade unions...
Are you in the right party, Jonathan?
I did see Keir earlier, and I did joke with him, and he said that the only way I was going to have a chance of winning my seat was by joining Labour, and I said, you'd never get me through the PLP. So I said, there's no point in trying.
I think that might be right.
There you go. But look, I will say this. Look, I like...
He's probably spot on there.
I like Keir Starmer. I don't think he's a bad guy. He's not somebody who scares me like Jeremy Corbyn did, to be perfectly frank. But ultimately, I do still think that Rishi Sunak is the right guy to run the country. I think he's got the right ideas.
Let's just go back to that Financial Times headline. There it is. Labour cannot tax and spend its way out of the Tory mess, warns Blair. James, just to bring you back in, from momentum, you would naturally... I would imagine Blair is somewhat of the Antichrist, I would imagine, to a guy like you.
It's not to do with
He is the most successful Labour leader ever, one of the most successful Prime Ministers
He's
ever.
also pretty much the least popular Labour politician currently going, if you look at the tracker polls with YouGov, because he's remembered basically for two things. One, he let bankers do whatever they wanted. and there's a financial crisis, and
But he won 3
all the riz in the world won't put that aside.
One of the most charismatic.
And the other one is he let George, all the charisma in the world, I just said, can't sell that to the British people, which is why they don't like it. And the other thing is he let George W. Bush do whatever the hell he wanted, and all the perfume of Arabia won't cleanse his little hands. So we don't really need to listen to any more advice.
But we know,
really.
we hear that he's still very much the backseat driver in all of this.
And apparently 100 members of his organisation are preparing to come into Downing Street with some. I mean, all of these things should be quite worrying, because the policies that he is putting forward are ones which aren't in the interest of the overwhelming majority of people and aren't popular. The things that he's saying that Labour shouldn't...
He's the man to listen to, He knows how to win elections, Jake.
He won elections in a particular time in history. We don't live in 1997 anymore. The situation that the country faces is really very different, which is why things like taxing wealth, boosting the minimum wage, public ownership of energy and water, things like this have majority support among people who voted Tory in 2019, let alone Labour or other parties.
It won't help James's street cred, but he is right what he says about Tony Blair. If you come around Stoke-on-Trent, North Kidsgrove and talk, believe me, Tony Blair is not fondly remembered of. In fact, they remember him to be the guy in charge when lots of ceramic jobs went overseas to China and decimated the industry.
Well, I suppose
ceramics went to China. Was that meant to be some kind of gag?
From the potteries. I mean,
indeed.
China.
Indeed.
You get the joke. Yeah.
Jess, you were looking rather quizzical at James's assessment.
Funny enough, I spent the evening at a Labour Party fundraiser, and I spoke about how if I was to have my baby now, I was 22 when I had my last baby, my first baby, and it was. I'll never be more grateful that it was under Tony Blair's leadership. So, for example, my son just turned 18 and he had a child trust fund because Tony Blair didn't believe that only rich kids should have child trust funds. So my son has a pot of money that was put aside for him so that he could make some decisions about the opportunities that he could take.
What, you mean other people's money for you?
No. It was... Well, no, because it had to be paid. It was to encourage people like me to
rich people
save.
have trust funds because it's their money, isn't it? I mean, they're just giving their own money to their own kids.
Well, I had to save the money. It was me and my family.
Yeah, me too. I'm in that position.
But the incentive was given by Tony Blair's government because he believed that we had to level up all children, regardless of where they were born. I was also given childcare by the first ever free childcare ever. I had a minimum wage job and a council contract that no longer exists. I cannot express to you the amount that Tony Blair's government, when I had my first baby, gave me, and mainly because so many women were elected on that day, built a ladder with their bare hands for women like me to climb up. So by the time I had my second baby, I no longer relied on state support. I was a productive worker and I could make choices. And I owned my own house. My children have a better future than I had when I was their age because of that government. So it's all well and good, but the reality is I would give my right arm for my kids to be able to have their kids under the same circumstances that I have.
Most of that is still in place, of course.
No, a huge amount of that is being cut.
Your childcare is there. I think your childcare is increased.
The childcare is there, and you know, one of the things that I would critique the last Labour government on is that they didn't properly lock in things that couldn't be undone, and childcare is one of them. However, every council contract that both me and my husband worked on, gone.
Okay.